I'm looking out at everyone sitting here today, and it strikes me that you all have at least one thing in common. Every single one of you has legal rights. But while you all have legal rights, that doesn't mean you can access justice. There's a gap between the two. Accessing justice means knowing your rights even existed in the first place, and then what they mean for you individually. If your rights have been violated, accessing justice means having a way to enforce those rights. That means finding a lawyer willing to take on your case, having enough money to pay for their fees, and if it gets that far, paying for the court fees. And even if you do get that far, if you end up losing, you may have to pay the other side's legal fees on top of your own. That's a huge risk and a lot of money. So even if you have legal rights, accessing justice isn't easy. I became a lawyer because I wanted to change the way things were done, and I thought using the law was my best shot. The law is real, it's tangible. If you change the law, you change the rules underpinning society, and that's so powerful. Like when the law changed, meaning being gay wasn't a crime, or that parents couldn't beat their children, or that forced marriages are a criminal offense. And it's not just the law, it's also the courts and how they hold governments and companies accountable. Like how American voters are using the English courts to find out how their personal data was used to influence elections, or how the Supreme Court held that the government couldn't trigger Brexit without Parliament's approval. And while I'd been a lawyer for years, it wasn't until last year that I came face to face with just how powerful the law can be, but also how big the gap is between having rights and accessing justice. This happened in the jungle refugee camp in Calais in France, where I was working with unaccompanied children. Children who had legal rights, but no way of enforcing them. And so I went as a volunteer with a charity and a team of incredible human rights lawyers. I'd never done anything like this before, and I should have felt scared or nervous, but I wasn't. I was excited. We were actually going to use the law to bring about change. I met with Omar, a 16-year-old boy from Syria. He's so sweet with this great big, really infectious smile. He grew up in the countryside and he'd never known violence, certainly not ISIS or airstrikes, but they were the reasons he fled. When I met Omar, he could barely keep his eyes open. None of the children could. That's because they spent their days asleep so they could spend their nights trying to get to England. When I met Omar, he'd been in the jungle an entire year, and he tried every single night to come to England. I was so anxious, waiting for the decision on his case to come through. I knew he was becoming more and more desperate in his attempts, and each one even more dangerous. But the decision did come through, and I was there to meet him at the Eurostar terminal at St. Pancras Station, where he was reunited with his brother. And he was so happy and kind of surprised. The law had actually worked. It meant he was in England with his brother and not alone in the jungle. But that feeling, that sense of victory, it didn't last long. I went back to the jungle later that year, just before the camp was demolished. And this time, I felt something different. I realized the system was broken. There were people who had rights, but no way of enforcing them. And instead, it was back to teams of volunteers and charities to come up with a plan. Part of which meant coming up with questions to prove that these children were vulnerable and should therefore be allowed into the UK as part of the government's new scheme. And so as part of this plan, I went back to the jungle and I met with Fatima, a 16-year-old girl from Eritrea. And Fatima and Omar are not their real names. Like so many 16-year-old girls, Fatima had put, effort into her hair, and her nails had sort of bits of chip polish on them. She was so brave. But her body betrayed her. She was shaking. I asked her, "What are you most afraid of?" She didn't want to answer. I tried in a different way. "Do you have nightmares?" She said she did. She used to have nightmares of drowning, and that's because on her way to Europe, her boat capsized, and she watched her fellow passengers drown. But not anymore. Now she had dreams of something else. She had dreams of trying to get onto trucks in the middle of the night, of losing her friends and her companions, and of being alone. Bad things happened to her when she was alone. And as I was thinking of how best to ask the next question, she just turned to me and asked, "Why do you have to ask all these questions? Why isn't it enough that I'm a child and I'm alone in this place?" And that's when it hit me. I was so ashamed. I was ashamed that it wasn't enough that she's a child and alone. I was ashamed of having to ask these questions. I was ashamed of our government. But deeper than that was the sense of betrayal. I had believed the law would provide a solution, but it wasn't enough. What's the point of a right you don't know about? What's the point of a right you can't even enforce? There is no point. They're not even worth the paper they're written on. Fatima and Omar had legal rights, but they had no way of accessing the system they needed to in order to enforce them. The very people who needed the law the most couldn't use it. Something needed to change. And I'm not going to stand here today in front of you and say that I found the solution, because I haven't. And it's still not working. When it comes to these children, there are still hundreds of them alone and trapped in France and the rest of Europe. But what I can say is what it meant for me. For me, it meant changing how I viewed the law. Not just looking at legal rights, but looking to the entire system of how you can access justice. And there are so many barriers to overcome when accessing justice. But one of them is money. And so I decided to leave my job as a lawyer, and I joined a new startup called CrowdJustice. CrowdJustice is a crowdfunding platform built for legal cases. It uses technology to make the law accessible to everyone by enabling people to raise money for their legal cases. Now you can set up a crowdfunding page describing your case, what you're seeking to achieve, why it's important, and then reach out to your community to raise money. It's not just David against Goliath, but thousands of Davids coming together to take on Goliath. And in this way, crowdfunding is changing the rules of the game when it comes to accessing justice. And it's doing so in 3 ways. First, crowdfunding levels the playing field. It breaks down the divide between those who have money and those who don't. Now everyone can access the legal system, not just those who can afford it. Second, crowdfunding empowers communities. When you donate to a legal case that has a real, tangible outcome at the end of it, you're given a voice you may not otherwise have had. Like earlier this year, a Quaker and a Methodist minister broke into BAE Systems to try and disarm a missile bound for Saudi. They did so to save lives in Yemen for the greater good. In crowdfunding their legal defense costs, they gave everyone the chance to speak out against the sale of arms to Saudi. And last week, they were found not guilty. Or maybe it's speaking out against climate change by supporting the Portuguese children who were affected by the forest fires this summer in a landmark piece of litigation in the European courts. These are groups who are using technology to give people a voice, and together they're achieving things none of them had thought possible. third, and finally, what's so powerful about crowdfunding is that it means you're not alone. I was scared to leave my job as a lawyer, something I'd been doing for years, to join a new startup. I hadn't realized it until then, but being a lawyer had become part of my identity. But standing up for what you believe in is scary. It takes a brave individual and a team of talented lawyers to take on the government and to bring about change. But now, for the first time, they're not alone. Now they've got the support of all those people who have donated to their crowdfunding campaigns. We're only just beginning to see the scale of sexual harassment across industries. But earlier this year, a group of women did make that brave decision to speak out about a male musician's treatment towards them. They got hit with a defamation claim to keep them quiet, but they won't be silenced and are crowdfunding their legal defense costs. They've shown us the power of a community when it comes together, how you can use the law to stand up for what you believe in, and you don't have to do it alone. And so, finally, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away today, it's that the law is powerful, and you can use it to change the way things are done. And now, for the first time, the rules of the game have changed. Now, you're not alone. Thank you.